Well, to get more insight into this fight against terrorism that has lasted for at least 12 years, we're being joined on the news at 10 by Mr. Kabiru Adamu. He is a security and risk intelligence analyst. He's also the managing director, Beacon Consulting. Good to have you on the news at 10, Mr. Adamu. Well, what began as a local group of radicals over 12 years ago is now responsible for the deaths of nearly 350,000 people, more than 90% of whom are children, according to a UN report. So, if you can, help us understand why it has been very difficult to put a stamp of finality on this war.
Thank you and good evening. Now, the war is not a conventional warfare. It's a war that has been described by different people in different terms. One of the most commonly acceptable definitions is that it's an asymmetric warfare, where the fighters are enmeshed together with the population. And so the Nigerian military has found itself fighting a battle that it's not exactly used to. Now, what the government did when it realized this is to introduce the National Counterterrorism Strategy, which was meant to have at least 3 different components: the military component, then what is called the countering violent extremism. Now, the idea of countering violent extremism is to address the root causes of terrorism, and this would include illiteracy, poverty, some of the socio-economic grievances that are driving terrorism. And this was captured almost aptly by the Tony Blair report. Unfortunately, what we've seen in implementation is that there has been very little implementation of the CVE component of that counter-terrorism strategy. What rather has received more attention has been the military approach. So the effect is that the terrorists, unfortunately, continue to exercise influence. They are still able to recruit. They are still able to bring in their weapons. And to an extent, they still have considerable local support. And so with that scenario, that environment, unfortunately, they continue to thrive.
You know, I think that's a very important area that should be focused on, as you referenced. But looking at the cost that we've put into this in terms of personnel, equipment, and funds in these 12 years, would you say that we've been able to justify that amount of resources that we have put into this war?
Unfortunately, no. There is a school of thought, a perspective that is even discussing what is called the political economy of the funding of terrorism. And it's just a very big way of saying there is corruption involved in that political economy. And unfortunately, the angle that, for me as a researcher, I look at is the absence of a very clear and structured monitoring and evaluation mechanism within the counter-terrorism strategy that would allow me as a researcher, or you as a journalist, for instance, to look at that funding and say, okay, this is what was used with X amount of money. In other words, an auditable system that would allow anyone who, for instance, has the authority to look into that funding and say, yes, those monies were used for the purposes for which they were voted in. And so there is that perspective that also believes, because of this political economy of the funding of the counterinsurgency, some persons within the military hierarchy are interested for this terrorism to continue beyond the years that it would have lasted, as it were, we're almost 12 years into it and it's still continuing.
Right. So, on a final note, do you see any other Boko Haram in the making? I mean, we're battling so-called bandits, killer herdsmen, what some other people call unknown gunmen, and the rest. How do we prevent another Boko Haram from happening?
The tool is with us, actually. I mentioned the counter-terrorism strategy. And the mistake, I would say, by both the previous government and the current government has been the focus on the military strategy and not necessarily giving either similar attention or perhaps even more attention to the CVE approach. Now, as long as you have socioeconomic grievance, as long as you have illiteracy and poverty to the levels that we have in Nigeria, then unfortunately there will be groups that will capitalize on that to perpetrate themselves and continue these types of terrorism. So even if there is another Boko Haram in the making, the possibility of other groups sort of evolving into terrorist groups is very high once those conditions remain. So the key is to address those root causes, reduce the poverty, address illiteracy, address those socioeconomic grievances, and then strengthen communal cohesion. Once you do that, then you reduce the possibility of these groups from growing and expanding. And CVE is the most advanced mechanism that the world has put forward for doing this.
Well, Mr. Kabiru Adamu, Security and Risk Intelligence Analyst, as well as the Managing Director, Beacon Consulting. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on the news at 10.
Thank you for having me.